Hello and welcome to the programme which brings together some of the BBC's most experienced correspondents with international journalists who write, blog and broadcast to audiences back home from the Dateline London. This week, what happens when one of the world's founding nuclear weapons nations goes rogue? Can a strategic deterrent become a tactical weapon for the battlefield? And is war Europe's future, no longer just its past? Today's Dateline panel. John Simpson, the BBC's World Affairs editor, is in Finland. Jeffrey Kaufman has anchored news programmes in the US and Canada, reported from war zones. In the studio with me is Thomas Keelinger, who's been explaining the British to German audiences since the 1960s, a time when both Europe and his own country were divided. Welcome to all of you. It's good to have you with us today. I wanted to start, if I may, with you, Jeffrey. What lessons do you think President Putin has drawn from his previous military ventures that are informing this invasion in Ukraine?
I think that the lessons maybe not Putin's, they may be ours, and they are cautionary lessons that he will stop at nothing if he feels like it. This is a man who is devoid of a moral compass. He does not believe in the Geneva Convention, the rules of war. Cluster bombs are fine with him. Just look at Aleppo, look at Chechnya. He left craters in the earth where those cities stood. And we don't know whether he's going to do that in Ukraine, but we do know that he has the willpower, that he has the drive. And if he's angry enough, he could well do that. And that's really what's terrifying. He could not only drive the people out of Ukraine, destroy a productive European country in the process, but he could leave nothing left in large areas. And that's just, it's a devastating prospect. We are seeing that in some cities. We're not seeing it across the country or in large part, and certainly not in the capital, Kiev. But it's early days still. You know, we have to see where this goes.
Yeah, we're barely 2 weeks into this conflict. I wonder, John, what impact is all of this having on Russia's immediate neighbours, who presumably had made certain assumptions about the way Russia would conduct itself, for all the kind of grumbling and noises and the growls from Moscow on occasions, that they could be reassured that certain rules would not be broken?
Absolutely. Here in Finland, for instance, people thought they had a really good relationship going with Russia. It was good trading relationships, good political relationship, no real upsets or problems. And then suddenly there starts to be talk that Finland, like Sweden, might feel happier being in NATO. And immediately Russia threatens them with possible military consequences. Okay, maybe they didn't mean they were going to bomb or invade. Maybe they just meant they'd draw tanks up to the border where I am now. But the fact is, it really worried people. And it had the precise reverse effect of what presumably President Putin wanted. I mean, it's encouraged the Finns to think about joining NATO, and a majority of people here, according to the latest opinion poll, want to do that now. So it's an object lesson in how not to conduct your relationships with your near neighbours.
Thomas, we had an incident only on Wednesday where the Russian Air Force was in the airspace of the Swedish island of Gotland, and the Swedish flew up, and it was a bit of a confrontation. It ended peacefully, but it was perhaps a sign that there are lots of ways of tweaking the tail, as it were, of your neighbours without actually evading them or using aggression. Perhaps the biggest change, though, has been in Germany's approach. I mean, they've almost kind of abandoned decades of policy over this.
Well, it's just astonishing. It's such an about turn overnight, within days virtually, where we threw away all our sacred cows of political prudence and so forth. We stopped this Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, first of all, which was to be a main source for our energy supply from Russia. That's now gone, cost 10 billion to build. It's not going to happen, not going to go into operation. We sending military hardware, an unconscionable event in the olden days, only a few days before the conflict began. It was not thinkable that we would send Stinger missiles and anti-tank weapons to the fighters. We have now decided also to eventually upgrade our NATO contribution 2% of the budget every year, for which the American presidents had fought years after years, and it fell to Putin to convince pacifist Germany to turn around at one fell swoop. We also think again about nuclear energy. We wanted to completely phase out nuclear plants. That is now, by a Green minister of all ministers in the cabinet, been declared to no, we can continue to use whatever nuclear plants we still have for the interim period until we found new energy supplies. We have also economically talking about letting Germany go into bigger debt, which is another completely unbelievable procedure. This is a country that was to pay homage to balanced budgets and so forth, and now the finance minister comes and says, no, this is not a threat for the future. It's an investment in our future if we accept debt. And last but not least, we joined the sanctions of the West, including SWIFT sanctions, although there's this little exception for Germany for payment for the gas and oil we import from Russia.
Given you are so dependent, or Germany is so dependent,
yes,
that makes it even more extraordinary that they've been prepared to go this far.
Oh, it is, absolutely. And it's an unknown territory. It's terra incognita. And yet the country which used to be so afraid of doing anything out of the ordinary has gone ahead with 2%, 3%, 33% rather, and more, of the people following them. And it is an astonishing about turn. And Putin's action ended in a totally counterproductive sort of fashion. He has achieved the opposite of what he wanted to achieve.
John, just picking up on that point, I mean, the accusation that Russia has made is that listening but not hearing was the way the West had dealt with Russia over the past few years, and that has fed this resentment that may have contributed to this action. To some extent, do the Russians have a point?
Well, I used to think they had a point, actually, after 1991, when Marxism-Leninism collapsed in Russia. And I did think in those days that there was quite a lot of triumphalism on the Western side generally, but particularly on the American side, that Clinton and other people seem to want to show, to demonstrate to everybody that Russia had been defeated, not just simply had changed its ways. But now looking at the kind of things that are being said in Moscow, I'm not sure quite whether really the West's part in all this is so terribly important to Putin. I think he's just got it into his head that NATO is an aggressive state, that aggressive group, that America wants to break up Russia. No evidence for any of this, I have to say, but that's what he seems to think. And basically, he has this deep, deep resentment against Ukraine for having once been part of the Russian family, as it were, and now deciding to turn its back on Russia and move away. And I think we're really seeing that, the punishment for that decision. Putin's had weeks, months of isolation for COVID. I think he's been just working away on all this, and the few people that could have access to him have been encouraging him in that.
If I may add to when you think of that chilling speech he gave on television, Putin, that is 2 days ago, when he says he is not being moved from his conviction that the two countries are siblings, as it were, of one nation. And to think that when that is his awareness, that they belong together, to punish them in this atrocious fashion it reminds me of a sort of mad reaction of someone who is, by hook or by crook, determined to muster his power over his neighbouring country.
Which, Geoffrey, raises the question of what can be done about it in a slightly longer term perspective. I mean, the US Permanent Representative of NATO was talking about changing its long-term force posture, or at least discussing that with the other NATO members. That implies the alliance doesn't see this as a one-off, that this is Ukraine and that's it. They worry about the implications for that whole border section of countries immediately around Russia, and what lesson Putin will learn, and therefore what the West has to learn from that.
Well, I think it really picks up on the themes that John and Thomas have talked about. This is the law of unintended consequences. Just because you have an objective in war doesn't mean that you'll actually achieve that objective the way you think. And I think NATO it's extraordinary what's happened, not just to Germany, but and with the global sanctions. But look at NATO. You know, Macron was dismissing it as on death's door. Donald Trump said it was irrelevant. And now it's come back and found its original purpose, which is bringing Western countries together to defend themselves against the threat of what was the Soviet Union and now Russia. And the consensus is extraordinary. You're now seeing Western European countries sending troops to the border of Eastern European countries, jets to support the Ukrainian army, not with European pilots, I should say. That is the problem, though. NATO can do a lot of defending, and NATO may well expand as a result of this, as John said, into Sweden and Finland, potentially even one day into Ukraine many years from now, once we figure out how this settles. But of course, the problem is they don't want to escalate this. They don't want to go to that next level and send European troops in to support this war. So the outcome, long-term, emotions are high. And of course, people support NATO. Longer term, will this last? It may well have some after effect. But, 5-10 years from now, NATO may yet again be marginalized. But people, that being said, people may not forget this. This is a really traumatic moment.
You said emotions are high, but I've spoken to people in the States who say, well, actually, public opinion is not greatly moved by this at the moment. I wonder, having seen American troops come back from Afghanistan only last summer, whether there really is any desire in America to see those troops who've been sent over at the moment mobilized.
No, I think that's fair. I don't think there is. I think that the trauma of those forever wars, particularly Afghanistan, is very fresh. And I think also there is an American perception that this is a European war and it's a European problem. And Europe is very well equipped to deal with it. America is not rushing to fly across the ocean and across Western and Eastern Europe to support Ukraine with bombers and troops. I think that's very fair to say.
The difficulty then, if it is Europe's problem, Thomas, is that how does Europe express its determination? Sanctions are one tool. They will go so far, but in the end, if an aggressor has won territory through his or her aggression, and other countries accept that as the new status quo, then actually they are unable to they're not able to defend very much.
Well, at least they are, as John has said, they are united in strengthening the alliance as it is. That in itself is a huge plus. And the European nations will contribute to the costs of NATO and so forth.
But if you have a system where it says an attack on one member is an attack on all members, this mutual defence, that's great if you're in the club. But if you're outside the club, then it's at a time like this, it's incredibly scary. And isn't there, if you want stability on the continent, isn't that something you're now going to have to address?
Well, you have to continue to set boundaries for Russia and for Putin to go across them and start a tripwire occasion, which might lead to something bigger. In that, I have to say, you have to add to your military posture an element of containment. You've got to make Russia feel the price of her actions. And so over time, hope for, from inside Russia, protests coming to ameliorate its posture. It happens over the decades of containment in the First War. And George Kennan predicted in 1947 that Russia eventually will fall of its own weakness internally. It cannot sustain its domination. And so I think the Europeans are faced with needing to set boundaries for Putin, increase sanctions or whatever, add a containment element, and hope that eventually no further encroachments by Russia will occur. We can only hope for the best. We cannot be sure. But if we insist on setting the boundaries, as I keep putting it, for Russia, maybe we might deter Putin from daring further.
John, I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think actually the best hope is that what Kennan said is right, that the the whole sort of structure of Putinist Russia, like of as with Stalinist Russia and Brezhnevite Russia and so on, will just simply not be able to take the weight of the top man's kind of desires and wishes, and it will come to a juddering halt. I can't see much hope beyond that, because actually, until the last 10, 12 years, until before the adventure in Crimea in 2014, when Russia simply walked in and took it over with relatively little serious response from the West. Personally, I think that's what lies in the hinterland of this particular attack. Until that kind of thing is seen to be a matter of the past instead of the present for Russia as well as everything else, I think we've got problems.
Jeffrey.
I think also that there's an equation internally in Russia. One of the agendas in crushing the Russian economy in these very, very harsh sanctions and bringing such hardship is that it destabilizes the equation that gave Putin power. Russians have lived better in the last 20 years than ever. They have material goods. They have been able to travel to the West and take vacations if they're middle class, and they really have become kind of quasi-European. But the trade-off has been they don't get involved in Putin's increasingly tyrannical, despotic politics. You can live well if you let me govern the way I want. That was the trade-off. Well, that's gone now. They're now plunging into hardship. They're rolling back to 1998 when the country was in a crisis, when life was very hard, and suddenly Putin's that authority, that compact is gone. The hope may be that the people rise up against Putin and that that he's overthrown, assassinated, something like that. I think there's no evidence that can happen. He has such iron control. But I would say one of the consequences of this that seems almost inevitable is that he is not only in danger of destroying Ukraine, but he may well be destroying his own country. Russia is now such a pariah state. And just a moment happened to me today that I found incredibly moving. I bumped into a Russian woman here in London who I know well and have worked with, and just casually said, "How are you?" And she burst into tears and she said, "I feel so ashamed. I feel so guilty. I left Russia because it was such a hard place to live, but this is something else. I don't know what to do." And I think this is a feeling that is increasingly shared by Russians who are just observers in their own country's maniacal mission here. And it's going to leave Russia in a terrible, terrible spot, economically, politically, and marginalized.
John, the thing that chilled many in the West was last weekend when it was indicated that President Putin had given the order to put his nuclear forces on a higher level of alert, which reduces the time frame for potential use of weapons. There have been suggestions in recent years that maybe the Russian military's attitude to nuclear has changed, that they see some limited circumstances in which there could be a tactical advantage of deploying a weapon, knowing that the other side will not retaliate in that way. And that shifts from it just being a deterrent. But the implications of that are really quite serious, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely chilling. And I'm afraid, I think that there is a really strong chance that if Putin doesn't get his way quickly, and he's not getting it clearly, that he may decide to use some sort of tactical nuclear weapon in order to terrify Zelensky and the Ukrainian government and make them simply surrender. And what the West does then, I think, is very, very worrying. There's only one trump card. It's a name we haven't actually any of us mentioned here. It's China. The Chinese must be really getting very worried indeed about Putin. Their whole polity is based on the growth of the international economic community. Putin is doing everything to destroy that. Is it maybe possible that China will just step in and say, look, no more of this, sort it out?
I just want to come back to you, Geoffrey, on this nuclear question. Michael McFaul, who used to be ambassador to Russia when it was negotiating one of the New START treaties, so understands some of the thinking, said although it's a possibility, he still thinks it's a low possibility of some kind of use of a nuclear weapon. Nonetheless, it must worry the White House if this talk is even being considered in military circles in Russia.
Well, you know, the whole principle of Russia, formerly the Soviet Union, having nuclear arms and the U.S. having nuclear arms was this notion of mutually assured destruction. That if you blow us up, we're going to blow you up. We'll send them at you before yours land, and we're all going to be gone. So that was kind of the tacit understanding in the Cold War that led to thousands upon thousands of nuclear arms being aimed across the world at one another. And that's really what kept the peace, and that remains the case. And in fact, this is really the first time in the post-Cold War era where we have seen this kind of escalation. I think the Biden White House is very clearly signaling we're not going to be drawn into this tit for tat. When Putin escalated the level of alert on his nuclear forces, Biden said we're not doing anything. Now, maybe discreetly they are, but his point was let's not raise the temperature here. Let's not aggravate what's already a very severe situation by threatening to throw nuclear weapons at each other. I think John's right. I think that's what John says. I think is kind of the worst nightmare situation. If Putin feels he's being defeated, which for him has the same meaning as humiliated, that's when he might feel the need to lash out and say, damn to you, fire the nukes and so be it. Putin clearly doesn't care. It's his own vanity that's driving this. It's his own hubris that's driving this. And some people think he may be mad. I think that might be too simple. He's just maniacal.
Thomas, you were born in 1940. In the earliest months of the war.
Was the pity.
And you were born in Danzig, which had been a free
city. Where the war
city.
began, yes.
It had been a free city, international city, and suddenly that all came to an end. I mean, from your perspective, how does this moment feel?
Well, I must say the destruction of Danzig in 1945, I've always assumed was the result of Hitler's wars against Russia and the world. He was the pariah of mankind. And in a sense, although it was not per se a war, it was a terrible thing to happen, it was not an atrocity because Russia defended itself against an aggressor called Germany, and in the course of it destroyed all before it, including my hometown. The difference to the modern day is that the Ukraine people and the Ukraine country as a country is a peace-loving, innocent neighbor who's being overruled by an aggressive sort of dictator like Putin. And so he commits atrocities on the level which are crimes against humanity, which convulse mankind. And therefore, they hit me on a deeper level of sensitivity than even the destruction of my own hometown. And I cannot sort of compare the two issues. I grieve for the Ukrainians far more than I ever grieved for the loss of my hometown, because they are suffering an untold atrocity and crime for which there is no way to explain it. And I think it goes deeper nowadays than everything I experienced when we became refugees, had to leave Danzig and under atrocious circumstances and so forth. It is a bigger event at the moment, and the two things cannot compare, because this is an innocent country which wanted nothing else but be a free and democratic neighbor, and for that is being punished in the most inhumane, atrocious manner. We must insist on making Putin the pariah of the world, as Hitler was in his day. That is the only way to remind Russians and the rest of the world that there is a limit to what you can do as a criminal determined on having it your way. You can't have it all your way. There is going to be a price to pay. And the degradation of Russia is also a sad corollary of all this. But it's Putin, first and foremost, who has to be hit hard, and to remind him that nothing will go without punishment.
In our last minute, Geoffrey, what price do you think Russia could pay for this?
Oh, I think, as I said earlier, I think enormous. it's catastrophic for the average Russian person who doesn't want this to happen. I think Russia as a pariah state, Russia cut off economically, standard of living absolutely collapsing, the Western Europe, Germany in particular, weaning itself off Russian oil and gas, as had been warned for decades or for years. I don't see Russia recovering from this for a very, very long time. It is a tragedy for Russia, but I think to what Thomas says, this is provoked, unfortunately, by their leader, and the real tragedy is what is happening in Ukraine, and that is, it has to be stopped, and I fear that it's going to get much more horrific before that happens.
Geoffrey Kaufman, John Simpson, Thomas Keelinger, thank you all very much. More from Dateline, same time next weekend. Goodbye.